Welcome to the Chess Angle. My name is Neil. I am the founder and director of the Long Island Chess Club in New York, and I would like to start by wishing all of the chess dads out there a very happy Father's Day. I hope you're enjoying the day. Maybe you're spending time with family. Maybe you're just chilling out on the couch. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe you're enjoying the backyard, whatever it might be. I hope you're having a fantastic Father's Day. But either way, we're still going to be told to take out the trash. This podcast is sponsored by Chessboard. Be sure to check out chessable.com today. There is a link in the show notes. This episode is going to be our third game analysis episode where I'm going to look at a couple of my tournament games. And as promised, I'm going to start off by looking at a loss because I believe in the last one, we looked at a couple of wins or a win and a draw. And so I'm going to start with a game that was played against a 2100 player, so a much higher opponent. I was white in this game, and of course, it started out as a London system. Now, I will say, the London plays very well against higher rated opponents as well, especially at the club level. And interestingly, he didn't play knight f6 and g6 and bishop g7, which seems to be like the new thing now. It seems anytime I play d4, everyone and his brother, it doesn't matter if they're an advanced player or a beginner, the whole King's Indian setup, like with knight f6, g6, and bishop g7, that's like the new thing now. He did more of a knight f6, and then he did a bishop f5 setup, where he kind of mimicked my dark squared bishop with his light squared bishop. And usually when that happens in the London, what you want to do is get an early c4 in as white, and then you want to get in queen b3, because what happens is when he goes bishop f5, when black plays that, his b7 pawn is vulnerable, just like white's b2 pawn is vulnerable in the London. So usually you want to get in c4 right away. I played it a little bit later, but that's usually the thinking, because very often black will go for a symmetrical type of setup with the bishop. Now, of course, a King's Indian setup, I'm calling it the new thing. That's been around forever, and Fischer played it. I guess what I'm saying is it's getting kind of a resurgence, or at least in my games, this is just me, I'm seeing it a lot more than ever before. But when that happens, I mean, I'm very happy because the London plays very well against the King's Indian setup. Again, that's not what happened here, just kind of speaking about the opening in general. So this was kind of a symmetrical d4, d5 opening, and then he had knight f6 and bishop f5 right away. And it was pretty even. He delayed castling for a while, all right? And then we get to a middle game position. Now, I'm holding my own. It's pretty even up to this point. And despite his rating, I was playing very well, and it was an even game, but we got to a critical position. And the reason I wanted to study this game was because the thought process I went through here and sort of the mindset, I just kind of want to share it with you because maybe you can relate to it. Maybe you can learn something from it. And I really think for many of us, the whole mindset and attitude is a major part of it. So we end up with this sort of middle game position. This is around move 25. And it's a bit of a critical position. Both queens are in the middle. There's some pawn tension. I won't describe the exact position in an audio podcast, but the gist of it is I kind of have to think here. All right. Because if I'm not careful, he can, easily run me over. When we refer to critical positions, that basically means where your next move is very important. All right. If it's sort of a very dry, closed positional game where there's a lot of slow maneuvering, that really wouldn't be a critical position because usually you have a lot of choices. Many cases you can do a lot of maneuvering and move the same piece twice. But this is kind of an open, slightly tactical position, very tricky. But here's where I went wrong, and I want to share it with you. I'm looking at the position, and I had a queen move that seemed correct to me. And the reason I was hesitant, though, was because if my queen takes his pawn, it's blocked by a knight and a rook behind it. So if he moves his knight, there's a discovery on my queen, but I realize that's okay because my move also attacks his queen. So the point is, even if you're not following that, I saw a move where after a lot of analysis, I believed was correct, but for some reason I was feeling insecure about it. And then I saw another move, which turns out is not quite as good. And I ended up playing that move though. So what happened was I'm looking at it and basically I didn't trust myself. It was a confidence thing, and this happens. And of course, your opponent's rating is kind of swirling around in your head. I know that he's a very tenacious player, but the problem is you got to look at the position and you have to think objectively, and I didn't do it. So I looked at this other move, which something was telling me that it wasn't quite as good, but it just seemed less risky, so to speak. But the correct move, it just, I wasn't feeling it. But rather than trust my analysis, this is the point, rather than trust my analysis, I played the wrong move. And of course, if I had just trusted myself, I would have been fine. And so the lesson I learned from this game is, regardless of your opponent's rating, if your analysis is telling you that this is the best move, you need to do it. Now you may say, well, why didn't you play it? It was because of this discovery on my queen. If he moves his knight, I thought there was something there and I was wrong. But you have to, instead of saying, I think there's something there, you really have to analyze to see if it's true. Maybe another night I would have played this without a problem. But the point is I sort of psyched myself out. So you have to trust yourself. If you look at a move, or let's say you're deciding between two moves, and one of them seems correct and the other one seems like it's good too, but maybe it's safer but not as good, you have to trust yourself and you have to play with confidence. But it's that lack of confidence that can hold many people back in their progress and their rating. You can do all the puzzles you want, you can do all the studying you want, but if you don't trust yourself when you actually play, you're going to have problems. And that's what happened here. And I didn't trust myself, even though I felt this was the right move. I kept thinking that there was something he has that I'm not seeing, but I ended up losing the game because I fell apart from here. Because that's what happens, is one mistake then leads into another one. All right, so that was the first game. And again, I do want to look at losses in these game analysis episodes as well. I don't just want it to be my wins, because that's kind of lame. In fact, we'll probably learn more together from my losses anyway. So to put this in context, my over-the-board rating is slowly starting to creep back to where it was. I was 1887 as of about a couple of years ago or so. Then I had some bad outings. I probably played when I was too distracted, whatever, no excuses, but it ended up going as low as 1600. So it was a crazy swing. But now I'm back up to 1720. The last tournament I had was pretty good. I think it was maybe 1719. So another 80 points, I'll get back to 1800 where I was. And then the goal is to get to 2000. So it's kind of a two-prong rating goal for me. I want to get back to the 1800s where I was, kind of stay there, enjoy that, and then slowly work my way up to 2000. Now, of course, every 200-point rating segment that you go up is much harder. So in other words, going from 1400 to say 1600 may not be too bad, but going from 1600 to 1800 is a lot tougher. So I'm close to getting back to 1800 where I was. And then, like I said, part two will be to get to 2000. So if in the next couple of tournaments I do really well, I may be able to get that. My goal realistically, just because of my schedule and how much I play, I'm looking to get back to 1800 by the end of 2022. Hopefully it'll happen sooner, but I'm going to give myself that window, kind of, conservative. Hopefully I should be able to do that. But as I said, if I get back over 1800 by the end of this calendar year, I'll be pretty happy with that. So let's move on to the next game, which interestingly is also a loss to a similar rated player as my last opponent, about 2100. And I lost for a similar reason, which was basically not trusting myself and sort of psyching myself out against a higher rated opponent. And I'm always, saying not to do that, and you got to be careful. And, the point is I go through this myself. When I talk about these things to get better in these struggles, I'm right there with you. Okay. I'm not sitting on my high horse. I have to think about these things myself. All right. But in this game, I was black this time, and my opponent opened with knight f3. Now, knight f3, very common opening, very flexible. It can transpose into many different things. What I usually do against knight f3 is I just mirror it with knight f6, which is reasonable. But against knight f3, I mean, you could play almost anything. You know, you could play c5, you could play d5, you could play knight f6, you could probably play knight c6. Really doesn't matter. I usually do knight f6. So it was knight f3, knight f6, and then he played g3, going for the fianchetto. And then I played b6, because usually when your opponent fianchettos, you want a fianchetto as well. You don't have to. But my thinking was that I was going to transpose into some type of Indian opening, like a Queen's Indian, which is what happened, or a Nimzo Indian. Sometimes it transposes into the English opening. But let's talk about this, because when your opponent opens with something other than e4 and d4, it can very often transpose, but you want to do your best to control it into transposing into an opening that you know, which is what I recommend. And that's something I was able to do. All right. I basically transposed it into sort of a Queen's Indian, almost like an English opening type thing. But again, even if he plays c4 to open with the English, that can often transpose into like a Nimzo Indian or something like that. All right. But anyway, we basically transpose, as I said, into a Queen's Indian type setup, which I'm very comfortable with. And I was doing very well. And then it happened, which is what happened in the last game, right? It happened where you start to get insecure against your higher rated opponent. And for me, it's funny, this goes in phases despite me trying to fight it. There are other times where it doesn't bother me and I play well and I end up having a good result. But other times, you know, your opponent's rating gets to you a little more. I guess it depends on, you know, how tired I am, on what kind of day at work I had. I mean, there's all these factors that go into your state of mind. But for some reason, I just started to feel it, and, you know, I was getting nervous and there was no need for it. So at one point, he's making some threats against my pawn on c5, and I was totally fine. Like, looking at it now and then looking at it afterwards, and it always works out this way. I just had some very simple responses, and I ended up getting myself into trouble. And the other thing I didn't look for was that even if he takes this pawn on c5, I can actually tactically give up a pawn there, and then I get an attack on his king, because after we had traded light squared bishops, that is, on g2, his king is a little vulnerable on that long light squared diagonal. It really goes back to the conversation I had with Grandmaster Romain Edouard. You should check out that episode if you haven't. And he talks about being objective, which is you have to trust your analysis and you have to go by the position and your analysis and what the board says, and not let emotion get in the way. But I made that mistake in the last two games. And it's hard to do. You have two humans going at it. Emotion's going to be a part of it. But in both of these games, if I had objectively looked at the position and if I had trusted my analysis, I would have been fine. And the truth was, in this second game, even though I made this mistake earlier on, I actually had some chances later on, but you just put yourself into this mindset that this person is so much higher rated, you know, and then you end up losing the game. Now, other times, and these aren't games I looked at here, other times I've done very well against higher rated opponents. And unfortunately, I need to make that more consistent. You know, other times I don't get intimidated by them and I do very well and I'm objective and I end up winning or drawing. But of course, I don't want every game analysis to be just those games and make it seem like this doesn't happen. You know, I deliberately wanted to look at two games where I lost strictly because of the thought process. Now, I'll say this. If you find yourself studying a lot, but you're losing a lot of games, you know, and this is something, you know, I go through as well. it's probably something with your mental state, meaning your thought process, the psychological aspect of the game, that whole thing. And keep in mind, as an adult improver, I just want to share a few things about improvement. Studying chess theory alone is only part of it. I remember for me, when I first got into tournaments, it wasn't until my 20s. And I had a tough time actually with the whole, using a chess clock and keeping score and touch move and all that stuff. So I lost a lot of games when I first got into tournaments just because I wasn't used to tournament conditions. And realize also, and Tim Mirabile spoke about this at length, there are a lot of things that you need to work on or sort of improve upon that you really can't get from studying, that just come from experience. Like, for example, not hanging pieces, I think comes more from experience than just studying. I mean, you can probably study that to a certain extent, but a lot of that is experience. Not getting intimidated by a higher rated opponent, that comes from experience. I don't really think there's a specific exercise you can do. You can maybe look at a position. Okay, here's a position where, the opponent was rated higher, but the problem is when you study at home, it's inanimate. It's just you and a position, or you and a computer, or you and a board. When you're actually in an over the board situation in person with an opponent, it's just different. And that comes from experience. Okay. Dealing with fatigue and exhaustion, that comes from experience. Playing an over the board game after a long day at work, or maybe after you dealt with something at home, that comes from experience. And I see a lot of players who are losing games and whose ratings are not improving despite their studying, because they're not learning from these sort of in-person tournament conditions. And these are things that you have to get used to. So a lot of it comes just from playing. Here's a great example. I get emails all the time, or players will stop by the club and ask me in person, well, Neil, am I ready to play in a tournament? Because I'm kind of a beginner. I kind of wait. I want to wait till I'm ready, they say. And I say, well, there you go. I go, that's your mistake. There's no such thing as sort of waiting till you're ready. It's not like you can do something where, okay, if you do this and study this for 6 months, when you enter your first tournament, you're going to do great. It doesn't work that way. The way to learn how to play in tournaments is to play in tournaments, right? What's that old saying? What we need to learn to do, you have to learn by doing. So I tell people, I go, the best way to learn is just jump in. I go, you're probably going to lose a lot of games right away. We all did, but that's the best way to learn. It's not like if you're a beginner, you can sort of prepare some way to all of a sudden be ready for tournaments, because that's what everyone wants, right? That's how we are. It's like, well, I kind of want to just join my first tournament and do well right away. Well, guess what? It doesn't really work that way. It could, there are exceptions, but the best way to learn how to be ready to play in a tournament is to just do it. Okay. Just show up, play. You're going to take your lumps. You're going to make these mental mistakes. And again, there are certain things that you have to learn just from playing and just from experience that aren't going to come from a book, or that aren't going to come from doing a puzzle online. All right. So before we wrap this up, this will be a little bit of a shorter episode. I want to share something I've been doing with my over the board games that's been really helping. This may seem almost too simple, but it's something that's been helping me as far as board vision and analysis, and just sort of feeling like I have control of the game. And this is what it is. In the opening phase of the game, let's say the first 7 to 8 moves or so, maybe the first 10 moves, I've been playing very slowly and very deliberately, even if it's a book opening where I know what the next move is. I'll deliberately slow it down, and I feel like that helps me maintain control and concentrate more. And it helps avoid, these sort of quick moves or these mistakes or blunders. So let me explain what I mean. Let's say I'm white. Okay. I'm playing the London. So if my opponent, okay, I play D4, I should say, and then my opponent plays knight F6. Well, I know I'm going to play bishop F4, but instead of just whipping it out right away, I'll just take a moment, breathe, then play it. Okay. And then maybe he plays something else, and I know I'm going to play E3 right away, but I'll still take a moment and I'll deliberately take my time. So it's like I'm sort of setting the pace for myself, because I find sometimes if I move quickly, even if I know what I'm going to play, it sort of puts you in a certain state of mind. So by slowing things down and by controlling the pace, I feel like I'm thinking better and in control of the game more. I did that in my last tournament, and I actually had a couple of nice wins against higher rated opponents, but it's something that I just wanted to share, because I know we play online a lot also. And if you're doing a 5-minute blitz game, you're so used to playing quickly. So what I'm sharing is more of an over the board thing for your classical time controls, because I know a lot of you were playing in those tournaments as well. A lot of you were playing in those major weekend events. All right. But think about doing that in the opening phase of the game. Even if you know what it is, even if it's a book opening, still slow it down, and that way you feel in control and you get in this mindset where you're not going to rush, and maybe you'll look a little bit deeper. All right. So those are my thoughts for this week. I wanted to look at 2 of my losses, 2 games where it was more about the mindset than it was about chess theory. We talked about trusting your analysis, having confidence, not getting intimidated by your higher rated opponent. Usually not something I struggle with that much anymore, but it still does happen. I still have to remind myself, and these were 2 games where that did happen. So I wanted to share that because, again, a lot of this journey, a lot of chess at the amateur level, even at the highest levels, but especially at this level, a lot of it really is about the psychological aspect of the game and about the mindset. And if you're studying a lot, but your results on the board are not commensurate with that, hopefully some of the things I talked about today may help with that, because it's something that we all struggle with, but you want to deal with it to a point that your results are improving and not worsening. All right. So I wanted to share that. Again, I hope you have a wonderful Father's Day for all the dads out there. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.